Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, September 29th, where I wanted to talk about some quotation for the last three short stories that we discussed previously, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal. Also wanted to talk about journal number one as we are nearing the ending of our short story unit. So, according to our syllabus, and you can see this in the notes below, journal number one would be due today if you're watching this on the 29th at 11:59 p.m. or earlier via PDF, please, because that's what works best with my grading program, to my email. That's also what works best with my grading program, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. However, we are a little bit behind schedule, and our next class is scheduled as a catch-up class. So if you wanted to, you could submit your journal the following class, which is the 4th of October, our catch-up class. And the journals are about three short stories. So I'm asking you to select three of the pieces that we read in our short story unit and to respond in about a page or so for each of the three that you select. So your journal should be approximately 3 pages long, but as long or as short as it needs to be. It's an informal response. I am not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics, which means you don't even have to write in complete sentences. You can write in outline form or in bullet points if you so wanted. And I evaluate it informally on a checkmark system, with a plus being excellent, check plus being very good, check being satisfactory. That's where most of the grades are. And I'm hopeful that the journals will help you eventually formulate a paper, which is something that we need to talk about over the next several classes. Possible paper topics that you could pursue, though you can also create your own paper topic, as well as ways to go about writing an academic paper. So that's what's coming up. But in terms of the quotes for Young Goodman Brown, we talked a little bit about how this story is an allegory. So it is representational. And at the very beginning of the story, we're told that young Goodman Brown came forth at sunset into the street of Salem Village. And that, of course, is filled with information. Salem, so well known for the witch trials. Sunset, so this is representing descent. And the name Young, which represents innocence and being naive. Goodman, which represents that he is a good man, but that's also his title, as would have been the titles at the time. Goodman for Mr. and Goody for Miss or Mrs. And Brown, I suggest, is a particularly appropriate name for him, not only because of the fact that it is a common surname, and this story suggests that this is a common journey that all of us take when we have to learn about the hypocrisy of our society. But also, brown is the color of soil, and he happens to be in the wilderness. And one of the things that he learns is that humanity is soiled, which would go very much against the Puritan ethos of either completely holy or completely corrupt with no in between. So, as the story continues on, we learn a little bit about Goodman and his time period. And this figure who accompanies Goodman could be a devil figure, says to Goodman, and this is around paragraph 18. I've been well acquainted with your family, the traveler is talking to Goodman, as ever one among the Puritans, and that's no trifle to say. I helped your grandfather, the constable, when he lashed the Quaker woman so smartly through the streets of Salem. And it was I that brought your father a pitch pine knot, kindled at my own hearth, to set fire to an Indian village in King Philip's War. Now, of course, the language is going to be somewhat archaic because of the time period of this piece from the 1800s. So we're going to have to do a little bit of interpretive analysis to try to understand plot, and then more interpretive analysis to try to understand theme. But basically, what this traveler is saying is that he has had acquaintance with members of Goodman's family. So if this traveler is evil, therefore Goodman's family has been evil, such as his grandfather, the constable, who basically lashed or hit a Quaker woman in the streets, and also Goodman's father, who basically set fire to an Indian village. So the traveler is suggesting that Goodman's family has evil within it. And of course, Goodman is horrified by the idea of that. And as Goodman continues, he sees more and more individuals from the community that he would never expect. And he's so overcome with the horror of it. This happens to be around paragraph 51 to 53 or so. In truth, all through the haunted forest, there could be nothing more frightful than the figure of Goodman Brown himself. On he flew among the black pines, brandishing his staff with frenzied gestures, now giving vent to an inspiration of horrid blasphemy, and now shouting forth such laughter as all the echoes of the forest laughing like demons around me. His demon in his own shape is less hideous than when he rages in the breast of man. And of course, the point of the story isn't whether or not the witch meeting occurred. We can never determine that based on the way that Hawthorne has constructed this piece. The point of the story is how Goodman changes for the worst because of his realization of the evil that is inherent within everyone. And Goodman never accepts the idea that evil is also within his own breast, or else he would not be on this journey to this supposed witch meeting. But we get from the figure that is a possible satanic figure, the point of the story when the figure says, and this is in paragraph 64 or so, there resume the sable form, all whom ye've reverenced from youth. Ye being you, ye deem them holier than yourselves and shrank from your own sin, contrasting it with their lives of righteousness and prayerful aspirations heavenward. Yet here are they all in my worshipping assembly. This night it shall be granted you to know their secret deeds. How hoary bearded elders of the church have whispered wanton words to the young maids of their households. How many a woman, eager for widow's weeds, has given her husband a drink at bedtime and let him sleep his last sleep in her bosom. How beardless youths have made haste to inherit their father's wealth, and how fair damsels, blush not, sweet ones, have dug little graves in the garden and bidden me, the sole guest, to an infant's funeral. And basically what this figure is doing is talking about what happens behind closed doors, that the elders of the church basically are trying to seduce the young maids, in other words, the young virgins of their households. How women, realizing the advantages that could come with widowhood, rather than waiting for nature to take its natural course, they give their husbands a drink at bedtime and let him sleep his last sleep. In other words, they poison their husbands so they can become widows. How beardless youths, so these are young men who are so young that they don't have beards yet, have made haste to inherit their father's wealth. So they've basically murdered their fathers so that they could have the inheritance. And how fair damsels, young women, blush not, sweet ones, have dug little graves in the garden and bidden me, the sole guest, to an infant's funeral. That these young women who seemingly are virginal are not only not virginal, but they are unmarried, and if they were to become pregnant, what an option would be to kill the child upon its birth or before its birth, and to bury the corpse in the garden. So this is the reality behind the projected image of Puritan society. And of course, we know that Goodman takes this very badly, and Hawthorne is quite aware that we're still probably focused on the idea of whether the witch meeting occurred, and even asks us point blank in paragraph 80, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep in the forest and only dreamed a wild dream of a witch meeting? And this is the answer. Be it so if you will. In other words, yeah, whatever. But it was a dream of evil omen for young Goodman Brown, a stern, a sad, a darkly meditative, a distrustful, if not a desperate man did he become the night of that fearful dream. On the Sabbath day, when the congregation was singing, he couldn't listen because an anthem of sin rushed loudly upon his ear. When the minister spoke from the pulpit with power and eloquence, and his hand on the open Bible, and talked about saint-like lives and triumphant deaths, Goodman turned pale, dreading lest the roof should thunder down upon the blasphemer and his hearers. Often at midnight, Goodman shrank from the bosom of faith. And at morning or evening time, when the family knelt down at prayer, Goodman scowled and muttered to himself and gazed sternly at his wife and turned away. And when he had lived long, in other words, Goodman lived a long time, and was borne to his grave a hoary corpse, eventually he did die, followed by Faith died after him, an aged woman, and children and grandchildren, a goodly procession, so they made a large family. Besides neighbors not a few, they carved no hopeful verse upon his, Goodman's, tombstone, for his dying hour was gloom. That Goodman becomes such a dark and bitter man that they can't put anything hopeful on his tombstone, because obviously he will not be entering into heaven in the afterlife. The lesson being for us that our faith, and that's literal and figurative, should not be destroyed because we realize that hypocrisy or evil exists in society. And then we go to Soldier's Home, a piece that sounds much more contemporary. It's one of the reasons why perhaps Hemingway is a favorite. There's a lot of dialogue in Hemingway's writing, which is one of the reasons why it's easier to read, in that dialogue usually is much easier than exposition, background information. It's why watching a movie might be easier than reading a text. And what we're told in Soldier's Home, while Hemingway is quite simple with this language, that doesn't mean that the language is simplistic. The story begins with Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college in Kansas. There's a picture which shows him among his fraternity brothers, all of them wearing exactly the same height and style collar. And then in the next paragraph, we're told about another picture. There's a picture which shows Krebs on the Rhine with two German girls and another corporal. Krebs and the corporal look too big for their uniforms. The German girls are not beautiful. The Rhine does not show in the picture. And there's so much symbolism in the contrast of these two pictures. The idea of a fraternity being very similar to the military in terms of training young men to wear the same clothing and to engage in a brotherhood. And then the reality of war, as opposed to the romanticized version of war, that in the picture, Krebs and the corporal look too big for their uniforms. Not only do the uniforms not fit, but also you could say that they've outgrown their uniforms. They've outgrown the military. And the German girls are not beautiful, which was oftentimes a selling point for the military, and that this would be a way to attract the opposite sex. And the Rhine doesn't even show in the picture. Another of the selling points of the military is that you could see the world. Again, think about the time in which this was written in 1925. There's a very romanticized version of war and serving, and also being a veteran afterwards. And this story questions all of that at a time period when it wouldn't have been common to question it. So what we've got are authors who are making some rather bold statements for their time period. And we learn a little bit about Krebs in paragraph 18 or so, when he sat there on the porch reading a book on the war. It was a history, and he was reading about the engagements he'd been in. It's the most interesting reading he'd ever done. He wished there were more maps. He looked forward with a good feeling to reading all the really good histories when they would come out with good detail maps. Now he was really learning about the war. He'd been a good soldier. That made a difference. So not only is this a solitary activity, and he's engaged in lots of solitary activities, such as playing the clarinet, for instance, but he's reading about the war to illustrate that even though he no longer is at the war, he is still, at least intellectually or emotionally, part of the war. This is also where he gets his validation, not from the civilians in his society, not from his family, but from a text. And he's also looking at the maps, because we could say that Krebs is ultimately in this piece searching for direction. And then, of course, that very famous scene with Krebs and his sister calls him Hare, his nickname, talking about the way that perhaps a hare or a rabbit could have comparable elements to Krebs himself, being skittish, for instance. And she asks, "I'll tell them you're my beau. Aren't you my beau, Hare?" And she says, "You bet." And he says, "You bet." Couldn't your brother really be your beau just because your brother? And he says, I don't know. And she says, sure, you know. And couldn't you be my beau, Hare, if I was old enough and you wanted to? And he says, sure, you're my girl now. Am I really your girl? Sure. Do you love me? Uh-huh. Do you love me always? Sure. Will you come over and watch me play indoor? Maybe. I mean, these are just rote answers. This is a man who does not want consequences. But there really are no consequences with just giving his sister the answer she wants, because they really can't have a romantic relationship. Notice how he's willing to tell her what she wants to hear until she starts asking if he will attend her game. In other words, is he willing to go out into a social venue? And we know that that's something that he's been avoiding. And this idea of love, his mother asks him shortly thereafter, point blank, don't you love me? And he says, I don't love anybody. Not the right answer, certainly for a son to tell his mother, no, I don't love you. And then afterwards, he tries to take it back and he says, I know, Mommy. I'll try and be a good boy for you. This is around paragraph 85. Notice how his language changes, so it becomes so infantile. But again, he's just merely trying to appease her. And the mother, prior to that, had told Krebs, you know, we love you. And this is in paragraph 70, and she's talking about the father as well as herself. You know, we love you, and I want to tell you for your own good how matters stand. Your father does not want to hamper your freedom. He thinks you should be allowed to drive the car. If you want to take some of the nice girls out riding with you, we are only too pleased. We want you to enjoy yourself. But you're going to have to settle down to work, Harold. Your father doesn't care what you start in at. All work is honorable, as he says. But you've got to make a start at something. He asked me to speak to you this morning, and then you can stop in and see him at his office. Again, this is so telling in that ultimately that car is not just a generous offer. It comes with strings, and Krebs is not willing to pay the price, and that he needs to re-enter into what his parents believe is normality. And of course, his parents have a point. And he does need to find a way to reintegrate into society. But Krebs also has a point in that he's not ready to reintegrate into society. So notice that we don't get black and white characters or black and white issues when it comes to literature. No Faye and Kai here from A Sorrowful Woman. That we can see both perspectives. And also that the mother is speaking for the father, which shows the distance between the father and Krebs. So then I wanted to end with some quotation. Well, actually, let me just continue on with talking about Krebs and not wanting consequences before I go on to the next piece. We know that Krebs had been sickeningly badly frightened all the time, but that's something that he doesn't necessarily want to admit because people don't want to hear that. So instead, he lies. His lies were quite unimportant and consisted in attributing to himself things other men had seen, done, or heard of, and stated as facts. But even his lies were not sensational at the pool room. Again, I think pool is so appropriate because you point and shoot. And we know that he spends his time during late summer, so this represents the possibility of dissent. He was sleeping late in bed, getting up to walk down to the library to get a book, eating lunch at home, reading on the front porch until he became bored, walking down through the town to spend the hottest hours of the day in the cool dark of the pool room. In the evening, he practiced on his clarinet, strolled downtown, read, and went to bed. He was still a hero to his two young sisters. His mother would have given him breakfast in bed if he wanted it. I can't help but think here about A Sorrowful Woman, how she gets breakfast in bed and said she's the luckiest woman. But this is not the kind of support that she needs. And again, being told that he's a hero to his sisters sort of gives us a sense of what's going on with the sister later when they have that conversation about being a beau. And then in paragraph 12, he did not want any consequences. He did not want any consequences ever again. He wanted to live alone without consequences. Besides, he didn't really need a girl. The army had taught him that. It was all right to pose as though you had to have a girl. Nearly everybody did that, but it wasn't true. You did not need a girl. That was the funny thing. First, a fellow boasted how girls meant nothing to him, and he never thought of them, and they could not touch him. Then a fellow boasted that he could not get along without girls. And he had to have them all the time. That he could not go to sleep without them. That was all a lie. It was a lie both ways. Notice how lying is a major theme, suggesting that the military as well is based on lies. And again, you don't necessarily have to agree with Hemingway's perspective, but at least you want to be able to identify Hemingway's perspective through the character of Cripps. And Cripps says he would have liked a girl if she'd come to him and not wanted to talk. But here at home, it was all too complicated. He knew he could never get through it all again. It was not worth the trouble. There was that was the thing about French girls and German girls. There was not all this talking. You couldn't talk much and you didn't need to talk. And the reason why is because they didn't speak English. So that would be the ideal relationship for him, where there wouldn't have to be any kind of emotional intimacy. Physical intimacy is fine, but it's emotional intimacy because that leads to the possibility of getting hurt. And of course, he doesn't want consequences. So this piece very much examines the way that war changes individual. And again, for the time period, this would have been rather startling. And we end with Battle Royal, or at least that's the third story that we had discussed. And Battle Royal, I had indicated, is part of a much larger novel. So in some ways, we're at a disadvantage with reading Battle Royal. But even with reading that first chapter, which was released as a short story, we can get a sense of Ellison's writing style and his incredible use of symbolism. And we're told at the very beginning in the first paragraph that it goes back a long way, some 20 years. So this establishes that this is an adult narrator looking back on his youth 20 years ago. And the narrator says that he had to discover that he was an invisible man. The narrator feels invisible because the society in which he lives does not acknowledge his individuality. It sees only the color of his skin. But we need to learn that through reading the novel. And the invisible man tells us, yet I'm no freak of nature nor of history. I was in the cards, other things having been equal or unequal 85 years ago. I'm not ashamed of my grandparents for having been slaves. I'm only ashamed of myself for having at one time been ashamed. So this helps establish the invisible man's history. And the invisible man talks about his grandfather, that on his deathbed, grandfather called my father and said to him, son, after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I've been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country, ever since I gave up my gun back in the Reconstruction. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. Let them swallow you till they vomit or burst wide open. They thought the old man had gone out of his mind. He'd been the meekest of men. The younger children were rushed from the room, the shades drawn, the flame from the lamp turned so low that it sputtered on the wick like the old man's breathing. Learn it to the young'uns, he whispered. Then he died. This is such an important quote because the grandfather is telling the truth on his deathbed, the idea that he was a traitor, a spy in the enemy's country, meaning the enemy being Caucasian society, and that he pretended merely to be meek so that he could have access within Caucasian society. And live with your head in the lion's mouth. And he says that's what I've been doing. The lion being, again, the racism and the prejudice of his society. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, and agree them to death and destruction. That through the guise of pretending to be meek, that would give him the opportunity to overthrow the system of injustice. And of course, we know that the invisible man is asked to deliver his graduation speech to some of the leading citizens of the town. I can't help but think of young Goodman Brown speaking to some of the leading citizens there. All of the town's big shots were there in their tuxedos. This is from Invisible Man, paragraph 5, or Battle Royal in Invisible Man from paragraph 5. All the town's big shots were there in their tuxedos, wolfing down the buffet foods, drinking beer and whiskey and smoking black cigars. And think about all of the light-dark imagery that Ellison uses. Tuxedos are light and dark, wolfing down the buffet, portraying the men as basically bestial and that they are consumers. They are smoking black cigars. They are basically consuming black cigars the way they will consume the boxers for their entertainment. It was a large room with a high ceiling. Chairs were arranged in neat rows around three sides of a portable boxing ring. And again, this is a literal boxing match, but it's also the symbolic boxing match that the disenfranchised and people of color are forced to engage in society, where they fight each other for crumbs rather than try to overthrow the system that has the true power. And the Invisible Man is concerned throughout all of this. I suspected that fighting a battle might detract from the dignity of my speech. Of course it does. We see how he's abused, misused, and humiliated. He is not ready to accept that at this point because he doesn't understand his grandfather's words, but he will. And the Invisible Man is shocked to see some of the most important men of the town quite tipsy. They were all there, the bankers, the lawyers, the judges, the doctors, the fire chiefs, the teachers, the merchants, even one of the more fashionable pastors. And of course, I think of the Invisible Man seeing the politicians, his family members, Goody Cloyce, who taught him his catechism. And then the Invisible Man sees a sea of faces, some hostile, some amused. And in the center, facing us, stood a magnificent blonde. They're presented with a female who's treated just about as badly as the African Americans are, because female would have also been disenfranchised at this time period. And this blonde is stark naked. There was dead silence. I felt a blast of cold air chill me. I tried to back away, but they were behind me and around me. Some of the boys stood with lowered heads, trembling. I felt an irrational guilt and fear. My teeth chattered. My skin turned to goose flesh. My knees knocked. Yet I was strongly attracted, and in spite of myself. Had the price of looking been blindness, I would have looked. The hair was yellow like that of a circus Cupid doll. Keep in mind his dream later on about a circus. The face heavily powdered and rouged, as though to form an abstract mask. The eyes hollow and smeared a cool blue, the color of a baboon's butt. I felt a desire to spit upon her as my eyes brushed slowly over her body. Her breasts were firm and round as the domes of East Indian temples, and I stood so close as to see the fine skin texture and beads of pearly perspiration. Notice the repetition of the P there. That's called alliteration, when you repeat the initial consonant sounds of words. Pearly perspiration. Glistening like dew around the pink and erected buds of her nipples. I wanted at one and the same time to run from the room, to sink through the floor, or to go to her and cover her from my eyes and the eyes of others with my body. To feel the soft thighs, to caress her and destroy her, to love her and to murder her. To hide from her and yet to stroke, where below the small American flag tattooed above her belly, her thighs formed a capital V. I had a notion that all in the room she saw, that of all in the room she saw only me with her impersonal eyes. And again, talked a little bit about last class, about the consequences of a black man looking at a woman, let alone showing sexual desire, which is why the Invisible Man is torn between love and hate. We see how ultimately this fight has been fixed. Again, that's a metaphor for the way that in society the fight is fixed. And we can view this not just in terms of ethnicity. Think about class and how 99% of the population basically fights against each other rather than fighting against the 1% with the power, the status, and the money. And the Invisible Man is left with the biggest and baddest fighter, Tatlock. And the Invisible Man proposes, let's throw the fight. Fake like I knocked you out and you can have the prize. This is in paragraph 29. And the response is, I'll break your behind. And the Invisible Man asks, for them? And he says, for me, you son of a bitch, that this is really the only way anyone can get any kind of honor in this rigged system. A system that's so rigged that even afterwards, when they're supposed to get paid, it turns out to be fake tokens. And they're lunging on a rug for tokens, or for coins, what they believe are coins. I lunged for a yellow coin lying on the blue design of the carpet, touching it and sending a surprise shriek to those rising around me. I tried frantically to remove my hand, but could not let go. A hot, violent force tore through my body, shaking like a wet rat. The rug was electrified, And I had discussed a little bit about how electricity is so important in this text because electricity is power. And this text examines who has power and who doesn't have power. And then, of course, finally, he's allowed to give his speech. But prior to his speech, the Invisible Man talks about that there was one individual, Mr. Colcourt, this is in paragraph 55, who owned a chain of movie businesses and entertainment palaces that tried to grab for the Invisible Man. He slipped out of his hands, but it was a real struggle, and that the Invisible Man feared the rug more than he did the drunk, so he held on, surprising himself for a moment by trying to topple Mr. Colcourt onto the rug. It was such an enormous idea that the Invisible Man found himself actually carrying it out, saying, I tried not to be obvious, yet when I grabbed his leg, trying to tumble him out of the chair, he raised up roaring with laughter and looked at me with the soberness dead in the eye and kicked me viciously in the text. So already we see the beginnings of how the Invisible Man could not be as meek and submissive as perhaps he appears to be. And then, of course, the misstatement during the speech, which, again, from any psychological perspective, that wasn't a mistake. That was a desire from his subconscious, where instead of saying social responsibility, the Invisible Man says social equality. That's very different. Of course, everything comes to a standstill, and he's confronted by that, and he says it was an error, that he was just swallowing blood, which is both literal and figurative. Of course, he's presented with a scholarship, which is supposed to be a good thing for college. And the Invisible Man talks about at the end, when I reached home, everyone was excited. Next day, the neighbors came to congratulate me, and I even felt safe from grandfather, whose deathbed curse usually spoiled my triumphs. I stood beneath his photograph with my briefcase in hand and smiled triumphantly into his stolid black peasant's face. It was a face that fascinated me. The eyes seemed to follow me everywhere I went. That night, I dreamed I was at a circus with him and that he refused to laugh at the clowns, no matter what they did. Then later he told me to open my briefcase and read what was inside, and I did, finding an official envelope stamped with the state seal. And inside the envelope I found another and another, endlessly. And I thought I'd fall of weariness. Them's yours, he said. Now open that one. And I did, and in it I found an engraved document containing a short message in letters of gold. Read it, my grandfather said, out loud. To whom it may concern, I am told, keep this N boy running. So yes, the use of the N word in this text, which I think is important in terms of its historical significance. And then the Invisible Man says, I awoke with the old man's laughter ringing in my ears. It was a dream I was to remember and dream again for many years after that. But at that time, I had no insight into its meaning. First, I had to attend college. So as the novel progresses, the Invisible Man goes to college and realizes that he's never going to achieve equality or respect or opportunity purely because of the color of his skin. And then the Invisible Man tries to change the political system, and realizes the same thing, that education and the political system, although they promise equality, don't offer equality to all because both systems are rigged. And then the Invisible Man tries revolution with a character named Ross the Destroyer. And what they end up doing, rather than enacting revolution, is literally destroying their community and themselves by destroying their community. So the Invisible Man realizes that that too is not a viable option. So as I had indicated last class, the novel ends and begins in the same way, with the Invisible Man hibernating, trying to determine how to best proceed, which I think is a brilliant ending because it puts the responsibility on us as reader to try to determine how does one change a system of bias and discrimination and brutality and inequality, and one that has its roots in slavery, the ownership of human beings. So that leaves us with two short stories, Girl and Popular Mechanics. The good news is that they are both very short, approximately a page and a half or so. So that's what I will do next class for our catch-up class. And then we can begin talking about papers. And note that we will begin our next unit as well very soon. So we are moving out of short story and moving into drama. Drama is a very different kind of animal than short story. It's obviously much longer than what you would expect in a short story. So we've got got more class sessions devoted to a particular drama. Dramas are also meant to be performed, which means that we should watch performance. Ideally, live, but unfortunately that's not logistically possible. But luckily we can see recorded performance that is in no way a substitute for reading the drama. Watching a performance and reading the text of the drama are two different things. They should both occur concurrently if it turns out that you are going to truly analyze a drama. So that's where some of our class time will be, for watching drama and then talking about drama. Ideally, what would happen is that we could talk about drama in its entirety. I realize that the ideal world is oftentimes different from reality, but in the ideal world, when we get to our first drama, which happens to be Oedipus the King, that you would have finished reading it in its entirety for the first class that is assigned for Oedipus the King, even though we've got 4 classes or so devoted to it. So that while we are watching and discussing Oedipus the King, you are reading the next drama, which happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream. So when we get to that point in the semester, or the first class for Midsummer, ideally, you would have read the play in its entirety. So as we watch performance and talk about it, you're on your third and final drama. I suspect you'll find that to be the easiest drama because it's the most contemporary and it's from American society. And that happens to be A Raisin in the Sun. Again, ideally, our first class with Raisin in the Sun would be the class that ultimately you have finished the play in its entirety, so that rather than reading the next drama, because there won't be a next drama, you can begin thinking about writing journals and papers about drama. So that's where we are headed in the future. So what's left is our attendance question. So what I did today with these 3 short stories, Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and Battle Royal, was I selected some quotes. So I wanted to ask you to select the quote. It could be a quote that I selected, or perhaps it's a quote of your own that you think is particularly significant in one of these 3 short stories. Just one quote from one of the short stories I'm asking you to identify in the attendance question, and to briefly indicate why you think that quote is significant. Again, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses as well as my responses to them. And that would give us a sense of what we would have talked about in class if we were meeting in person. So that attendance question will be due Saturday on the 30th of September at noon. Again, if you need additional time, please let me know. So please identify a quote from one of the short stories and briefly indicate why you think it's important. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class and put closure onto our short story unit. And also talk about future writing assignments, such as paper number 1. Take care. Bye-bye.